He was condemned to death by the Roman authorities, and while traveling to Rome, he stopped twice and wrote a total of 7 letters. Now, once again, we are introduced here to the later phenomenon of using a famous early writer's name to produce literature that has greater authority than if you put your own name on it. And so there are more than 7 letters with Ignatius's name on them. But the other ones are pseudo-Ignatian epistles, written by anonymous people in the hundreds of years after the time of Ignatius. And most of the time, they give themselves away through various anachronisms, saying things that Ignatius himself could never have said because such and such a thing was not a belief at the time, whatever else it might be. But what's really interesting is that back in I think it was 95 or 96, somewhere around in there, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society put out a series of articles in the Watchtower where they attempted to go through the early church writers and paint them all as Jehovah's Witnesses. And this is not uncommon. The Mormons will do it. Well, the Muslims will do it. The Muslims try to make the Ebionites, this group of Jewish, quote-unquote, Christians, they try to make them the real Christians, and Paul pervert everything. Everybody wants to try to turn these folks into something other than what they were. And I hope one thing that we do is that we don't try to turn the apostolic fathers into people they weren't, or the early church fathers into people they weren't. You recognize the good, you recognize the bad, and you take them for what they were, rather than trying to, the silliest thing we could ever do would be to try to turn all these guys into ancient Reformed Baptists, because they weren't. And we don't need them to be. And if you think that we need that, well, then there is a little book you could read called The Trail of Blood, which would be right down your alley, but it's really bad history. Anyway, there are landmark Baptists, by the way. The Trail of Blood is one of their favorite books. And I was introduced to that in high school, and it's like, oh, wow, we are the original Christians, and apostolic authority, and the whole apostolic succession, the whole 9 yards, and it's like, then I took church history and went, oops, glad I didn't mention that in class. Anyway, so there's this other stuff out there, and what the Watchtower Society did is their entire article on Ignatius was based on pseudo-Ignatian epistles. They never quoted the genuine Ignatius. They only quoted epistles attributed to him, which have been rejected by scholarship. And the reason for this is fairly simple. He wrote a total of 7 letters to the Smyrnians, to Polycarp, so an individual, Bishop Polycarp, to the Ephesians, Magnesians, the Philadelphians, the Trallians, and the Romans. And at the most, minimally 10 times in those 7 epistles, maximally 14 times. So obviously some of it's interpretational. 10 to 14 times, depending on how you interpret some of the texts, Ignatius refers to Jesus as God. He plainly, clearly, unequivocally refers to the deity of Christ. So, what are you supposed to do with Ignatius if you're writing for the Watchtower Society and you believe Jesus is Michael the Archangel? Well, here is a tremendous example of religious deception on the part of the society. Quote the pseudo-Ignatian epistles. Not where, and even in those, there's not going to be a denial of the deity of Christ. It's just that you can find stuff that isn't as high in its view of Christ and pretend that that actually represents the true Ignatius. And as long as you can control your people, as long as, and especially back in those days, the internet has made it tough on the witnesses. Really. Cable TV and the internet has changed the Watchtower Society. Someone could do a fascinating doctoral dissertation, I'm sure, on the control mechanisms and the evolutionary control mechanisms in tightly controlled cults by looking at the Watchtower Society in 1980 versus the Watchtower Society in 2010. That's a nice even number. So what happened in those 30 years? The advent of cable television and the internet. Well, personal computers. It's the digital age arrived, and the tight, narrow control that the society functioned under in 1980 controlled what you could watch, what you could read, everything. They just simply couldn't keep doing it. And there's information that they could just simply ignore. They didn't have to deal with their own history. They didn't have to deal with prophecies they had once made. They didn't have to deal with, they could change. They had their own books, and they published all their own books. And after the debacle in 1974, 1975, prophecy, they went back and changed their books to remove the prophecies that were in them. That's how much they could control their people. But once they're digitally connected, you can't do that anymore. They're going to be running into this information, and so you've got to change how you do stuff. And it really would be a fascinating project to look at what has been the result of that in the past 30 years. But they could get away with it back then because they would expect that their readers are going to believe whatever they're told, and they're not going to go to the library. They're not going to look up Ignatius. They're not going to run into his genuine epistles. And so they can simply deceive. And it is deception, and it's purposeful. We know it's purposeful because the very sources that they would quote of the pseudo-Ignatian epistles, we can look at those sources, and they identify them as the pseudo-Ignatian epistles. And in the very same book are the real epistles with the real references to the deity of Christ and the whole 9 yards right there. And we also know, because of a book that came out, I forgot the year now, called Crisis of Conscience, one of the former governing body members of Jehovah's Witnesses left the Jehovah's Witnesses, and he had been involved in doing writing for the governing body. And he even tells a story about how the witnesses, remember their 1914 prophecy? They were big on 1914 for a long, long time. They're phasing it out. They're getting smart, though. They're doing it very slowly. Instead of just you wake up one morning and everything's changed, they're doing it very, very slowly. But they had a prophecy based on